Hello everyone, this is Shannon here for Heffy Doodle. In today's video, we are going to create this simple interactive birthday card with the new A Little Shellfish stamp set, as well as the new Build a Cabin die set. We're going to start today's card by working on our background scene. The first thing I'm going to create is our sand slope. I have a piece of white cardstock here that's about 3 inches by 5.5, and I have the first snow stencil here. I'm going to position it and just trace the very top of that snow slope, and then I'm going to fussy cut that out. This is actually going to be our sand layer. So now I'm going to ink blend this with a couple distressed oxides. The colors that I'm using are on screen so you can follow along. I'm going to start with antique linen and just ink blend basically the whole slope with this. I start at the top, but then I flip it over and ink blend the bottom as well. Then I'm going to move on to my darker shade. This is tea dye distressed oxide, and I'm going to ink blend a little gradation here, a little dark at the bottom, and then blend up. Now that I have my kind of ink blending done, I'm going to do a little splattering to really make this look like sand. I started with Vintage Photo Distress ink, smushed it onto my work surface, then added some water, and then picked that ink up with my brush, and I'm just tapping on my brush with my finger to release a small splattering of that ink. I also smushed down some tea dye as well, and then I will even smush down some of that antique linen distress oxide and mix some water just to have some variation in color in my little ink splatters. Once I've splattered this whole kind of sand slope, I'm going to put that aside to dry. Now I'm going to move on to our water. I'm going to use this new stencil. This is the Tiny Waves Stencil. As you can see, it's very thin. I'm going to spray it with some Pixie spray first, and then I'll place it down onto the front of an A2 side folding card base. The Pixie spray makes the stencil a little bit tacky, so all those little tiny waves stick a little bit to the surface of the cardstock. I'm now going to place my sand down onto my stencil or my card front, as well as the Build a Cabin die, just so I can figure out where I want my water to kind of end and where I want my sky to begin. So once I kind of figure that out, I then place a piece of blue tape right on the stencil, and that will mask off that upper quarter of my card front, and then I'm ready to ink blend. I'm going to ink blend with a couple distress oxides. I'm going to start with Salty Ocean, and I'm going to ink blend basically the whole ocean with this color. I did find with this stencil that it worked better when you ink blend from left to right, so side to side, instead of kind of ink blending in circles. That way the waves didn't kind of move around on you, and I even held them the waves down in areas I wasn't ink blending. And then after I ink blended with the Salty Ocean, I created a gradation with Blueprint Sketch, and as you can see here, it's got a nice little gradation from kind of a darker blue to a lighter blue. Now I'm going to mask off the upper quarter again. Just going to place my painter's tape right on top, actually over a little bit of that upper wave or that top wave, and then I'll ink blend a little bit more with my 2 distress oxides, just a little bit lighter here so I don't lose the definition in the waves, but let's just kind of fill it in so it's not like that stark white. Then I'll carefully remove my painter's tape and my water is done. I'm now going to move on to the sky. So I created a mask a while ago out of contact paper using the Silver Linings Cloud Border die set. I just die cut a strip of contact paper with that. And contact paper is a little bit sticky, a little bit adhesive, so I just removed the backing on that and stuck that down onto my card front here, and I'm just going to ink blend with a little bit of tumbled glass distress oxide to kind of create the look of clouds in the sky. So I had a little mistake here. I got too much of that tumbled glass, so it kind of has like a blob of tumbled glass right there. So I'm going to use a sand eraser. This is a Tombow sand eraser, and that will kind of pick up or actually sand right off the paper that little blob of tumbled glass that I got. And then I'll reposition the mask here and just ink blend a little bit more clouds in the sky, then ink blend a little bit between the water and the sky, and that will actually finish my background scenes. Now I'm going to move on to the beach hut. So I have the Build a Cabin die set and several dies from that set. I'm going to ink blend a little portion of this scrap white cardstock, and then I'll die cut out of this little ink blended portion these tiny these tiny dies. So I'm going to ink blend a gray and a red. After I ink blended a couple little sections of this white cardstock, I'm going to place those dies on top of it, and then I'll run it through my die cutting machine. So I ran those ink blended sections through my die cutting machine, as well as the other dies through some white cardstock, and now all I have left to do is ink blend these last little two pieces of trim, really the roof and the trim around the door. I'm going to start with cracked pistachio, just ink blend the whole roof with that as well as the trim. Do have to be careful with this because they're so thin. I could have ink blended the white cardstock just like I did for the red and the gray, but I decided to ink blend, just because they were bigger section, I decided to ink blend them once they were die cut. And then I finished up with a little ink blending, a little darker with the Lucky Clover. So now I'm just going to adhere these all together. So I added some liquid glue to the backside of the trim and the roof and stuck that right down onto my beach hut. Now I'm going to create the life preserver here. So I'm going to adhere these tiny little red sections for the life preserver there. You could definitely have die cut all these colored sections out of colored cardstock if you prefer. I do like the consistency though of my ink blended background with my ink blended die cuts. I think that just is a very cohesive look. Now all I have to do is finish by adhering my little life preserver on my beach hut, and that is done. I'm now going to move on to my images. So I went ahead and stamped several images from a little Shellfish stamp set and VersaFine Onyx Black ink onto Bristol paper. Bristol paper is a really smooth paper which works really well for this very low water watercoloring technique that I like to do with Tombow dual brush pens. So I just quickly took the marker to the crab, colored some sections, so the darker sections I'm going to do it here with a really light pink. So colored the sections that I want darker, and then with a damp brush kind of painted over those colored sections to kind of activate that ink and spread it out. You'll see it here better with this red. So I colored first with the marker, then with a damp brush I'm grabbing some of that ink that I placed down with the marker and then spreading it out to kind of create a nice gradation over the surface of that shell. So I went ahead and colored the lobster the same way as I colored that crab, and now moving on to the sand cake. I picked out a couple markers that were similar in color to the Distress Oxides that I used for ink blending the sand for the background, and I'm going to color this kind of icing on our sand cake basically the same, a little bit lighter. Not going to really use the darker tan that I used for the bottom portion. And then once I finished that, I added some little dots with my two markers again, and now I'm going to move on to the candle. A couple greens picked out. I kind of basically like a cracked pistachio and a Lucky Clover, then blended with a little damp brush. Then I have a yellow, and then I picked a little bit up with my paintbrush of that red that I scribbled down onto my work surface. Now I'm going to move on to the bucket. I'm going to color this green, so I have my two greens again. I'm going to start with my lighter green here and kind of color the base. Then I scribbled some of my darker green down onto my work surface, picked it up with my brush, and I'm just kind of coloring in those darker areas here. I could have actually just went with my marker straight to the bucket, but I was being cautious just in case it was a little too dark. I really wanted to make sure that this bucket really matches the ink blended trim that I did on the beach hut, so I'm being cautious and making sure it matches. Now I'm going to move on to the shovel. I have a couple yellows picked out, start with my lighter, and then scribbled my darker down onto my work surface, picked it up, just add a little shadow to kind of the cupped part of the shovel. Now I'm going to move on to the present here, and this is a new color. This is a blue. This is similar to the blue in the water, or the salty ocean blue for the ocean. So I just colored that down, then blended it out. Now I'm going to use green for the ribbon and then my yellows for the star. So I'm going to continue to use those three kind of colors, the yellow, the green, or the yellow combo, the green combo, and the blue for the pinwheel and the party hats. So now that everything's colored, I went ahead and die cut it out with the matching dies. And I did add some white gel pen accents to some of the images as well. So now I'm going to stamp my sentiment. The sentiment is also from a little Shellfish stamp set. I have it positioned in the upper right corner of my card front, and I'm just going to ink it up in VersaFine Onyx Black ink and then stamp it. And now I'm ready to actually put this whole card together. I'm going to start With my sand, just add some liquid glue to the back side of this sand layer and then just stick it right down to my card front. Once I have that in place, I'm going to move on to my beach hut. I'm going to add some liquid glue to the back of the beach hut. Just make sure not to put any glue on the door because I want to make sure that it still can be opened. And I'll just center that and place that down on my card front. Then I'll grab this little negative piece here. This was left over from when I die cut the trim, and I'm going to position that right inside that door. That's what we're going to add our images to, and that kind of creates a look of like the inside of the little beach hut. So once I get that in place, I'm now going to move on to all of my other die cuts. So all of the die cuts that I colored. So I'm going to start with these crabs, just add a little glue to the back side of them and stick them down. Once I get all my kind of crabs and lobster in place, all my shellfish in place, I'm going to move on to the bucket and the pinwheel, stick those down. Then I'll grab that shovel and kind of figure out where I want that to go, and then I'll stick that right down. And then I have my last couple of images, which are the party hats. Just add a little dab of glue to the top of each one of those shellfish heads and then stick that down. And then I'm going to adhere the little step underneath the beach hut. And finally, I'm going to adhere the sand cake and the present inside that beach hut. So that's a fun surprise when you open up the door. I'll now hold the card up to the camera so we can get a good look at all the details in this card. It was so fun to build this really cute little scene, and such an easy interactive card with that simple hinged door. The Build a Cabin die does that all for you, which is awesome. And that die set, by the way, is so cleverly made. I turned it into a beach hut, but it could also easily be a doghouse as well. I hope you guys enjoyed today's card and video. If you'd like any more information on the products I used, please head over to Heffy Doodle. And thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.